Robert De Niro's historic townhouse in New York City has long been a subject of whispered rumors among those who have spent time within its walls. While the acclaimed actor himself has never publicly commented on the strange occurrences, close friends, house staff, and even guests have shared unsettling stories over the years, accounts that, when pieced together, suggest something beyond mere coincidence. One of the most commonly reported incidents involves the house's sound system. More than once, music has started playing on its own, even when the speakers were turned off. But it's not just any music, it's always old jazz or classical pieces, as if someone from another era is trying to set a mood. A longtime friend of De Niro, who once stayed overnight at the house, recalled waking up to the sound of a scratchy record playing in the middle of the night. Thinking Robert had left something on, he went to turn it off only to find that the turntable was unplugged. The sound continued for another few seconds before cutting off abruptly. "It was like someone wanted me to know they were there," he later said, refusing to spend another night in the townhouse. Another disturbing pattern of events involves the home's many antique mirrors. Several visitors have claimed to see strange figures that appear for a split second before vanishing. A housekeeper once reported seeing a shadow standing just behind her in a hallway mirror, but when she turned around, the space was empty. She quit the job shortly afterward. One of De Niro's assistants recalled a chilling moment when he was walking past a large mirror in the living room. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw what he thought was Robert himself sitting on the couch. But when he turned to greet him, the room was empty. De Niro had been out of town that night. While the actor himself has never addressed the rumors, some say he's experienced the eerie phenomena firsthand. A former staff member once let slip that De Niro had confided in a close circle about hearing his own name whispered in the dead of night, always in a hushed, breathy voice. He reportedly dismissed it as exhaustion or the tricks of an overactive mind, but others aren't so sure. While there is no official record of a tragedy in the house, some researchers have suggested that the building's history might hold some answers. Constructed in the early 1900s, the townhouse has changed hands multiple times, and there are rumors of an early tenant who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Could it be that a lingering presence still resides there, occasionally making itself known? Whether one believes in the paranormal or not, one thing is certain: Robert De Niro's New York home holds secrets. And sometimes, when the music plays with no source, when figures appear where none should be, and when a name is whispered in an empty room, those secrets demand to be heard. After years of being a quiet mystery in Hollywood circles, Robert De Niro's former townhouse in New York was finally sold to a wealthy young couple, Michael and Emily Carter. They had no interest in ghost stories, only in the home's historic charm and prime location. But from the moment they moved in, the house made sure they knew they were not alone. Their first evening in the townhouse was filled with celebration. They toasted champagne in the grand living room, marveling at the home's antique details. The night was peaceful until Michael woke up to the sound of music playing faintly from the living room. It was an old jazz tune, crackling as if played from a vintage record. He groggily checked his phone. No music was playing. "Emily," he whispered, nudging his wife awake. "Do you hear that?" She sat up, listening. The sound faded the moment they acknowledged it. Michael, unnerved but logical, assumed it was an old speaker malfunctioning. He turned over and went back to sleep. But that was only the beginning. A week later, Emily was unpacking in the master bedroom when she noticed something strange in the vanity mirror. For the briefest moment, she saw a woman standing behind her, a pale figure in an old-fashioned dress. She gasped and turned around. "Nothing." Shaken, she laughed it off. "It's just my imagination," she muttered. But that night, she avoided the mirror before bed. A few days later, she saw the figure again, this time in the hallway mirror near the staircase. This time, she swore she saw its lips move, as if whispering something. She refused to look into any mirror in the house after that. Michael, skeptical at first, couldn't ignore what happened next. One night, as he worked late in his office, he heard soft footsteps outside the door. Assuming Emily was still awake, he called out, "Hey, Em." No answer. A few moments later, he heard it. A whisper close, too close. "Michael." His blood ran cold. He turned sharply. No one was there. He rushed to the bedroom to find Emily fast asleep. That was the night he started believing. Determined to get answers, Emily convinced Michael to invite a medium into the home. The woman arrived, taking one look at the house before sighing. "There's a presence here," she said. "It's not violent, but it doesn't want to be forgotten." She walked through the rooms, pausing in front of the largest mirror. "A woman," she murmured. "She lived here long ago. She doesn't understand why everything has changed." Then, in the living room, she closed her eyes as the soft hum of jazz music seemed to drift from the walls themselves. "And he is here too," she added. "A man. He liked this place. He doesn't want to leave." "Robert De Niro?" Michael joked nervously. The medium smiled. "No," she said. "Older. Much older." For months, the occurrences continued. The whispers, the reflections, the music. Nothing harmful, just a constant, eerie presence that never let them forget they were living in a house with a history. Eventually, Michael and Emily made a difficult choice. The house was beautiful, but it wasn't theirs alone. They sold it quietly, never mentioning the ghosts to the next buyers. And so, the townhouse stands, waiting for its next residents who will, sooner or later, hear the music play when no one is there to turn it on. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The townhouse sat empty for months after Michael and Emily Carter moved out. The real estate agent, wary of the rumors that swirled around the property, kept the listing discreet. Eventually, a new buyer emerged, a tech entrepreneur named Daniel Rhodes. Young, ambitious, and utterly skeptical of the supernatural, Daniel saw the stories as nothing more than urban legends. He moved in alone, bringing only the essentials, a few suitcases, his laptop, and a single espresso machine. The house, stripped of its previous owner's warmth, felt colder than before. But Daniel, busy with late-night work calls and coding marathons, barely noticed the chill. First, it started with the door. One night, after hours of staring at his screen, Daniel stretched and decided to explore the townhouse beyond the rooms he used daily. He wandered through the dimly lit hallways, marveling at the details he hadn't noticed before, the intricate crown moldings, the heavy wooden doors. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Something about it felt off. He was certain he had never noticed it before, even though he had walked this hallway a dozen times. He reached for the knob. The moment his fingers touched the brass handle, a faint shiver ran up his spine. The air behind the door was colder than the rest of the house. Much colder. Slowly, he pushed it open. Inside was a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and at the center of the room stood an antique chair facing a full-length mirror. Dust clung to every surface, as if the space hadn't been touched in decades. Daniel's brow furrowed. This room wasn't in the floor plans. He had reviewed them before buying the house. As he stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath him, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He hesitated, glancing at the mirror. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong. The air around his reflection seemed distorted, warped, like heat rising from pavement. Then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. Behind him, a shape, not fully formed, just the suggestion of a figure, shifting in the dim light. Daniel spun around. Nothing. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his eyes. Just exhaustion, too many late nights. Too much caffeine. Still, he backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him. That night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard something. A soft creaking noise, like the sound of a chair slowly rocking. From the room at the end of the hall. Daniel Rhodes wasn't the type to scare easily. Logic ruled his world, and the idea of ghosts was nothing more than a relic of superstition. But that night, long after he had shut the mysterious door, he lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that he hadn't been alone in that room. At exactly 3:12 a.m., his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A notification. Daniel groggily reached for it, assuming it was just a late email. But when he looked at the screen, his breath caught. New photo added to your gallery. His pulse quickened. He hadn't taken any pictures. Heart pounding, he opened the gallery app. It was a single, grainy image, almost too dark to see. But as he turned the brightness up, his stomach twisted. The photo was taken inside the hidden room. The antique chair sat exactly as he had left it. But now, in the mirror's reflection, something else was there. A figure. Not fully visible, just a shadow, standing behind where he had stood earlier. Watching, Daniel bolted upright, scanning the room. His phone slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Determined to prove this was all just a strange glitch, some bizarre camera error, Daniel forced himself out of bed. He needed to see the room again in the daylight, when things would make sense. But as he stepped into the hallway, he froze. The door at the end of the hall, the one he had shut hours ago. It was open, just a crack. A sliver of darkness beyond. A breath of cold air slipped through, carrying something with it. A sound. Soft. Whispered. It wasn't his name this time. It was a number. 3. Daniel's mouth went dry. He took a step back, forcing himself to breathe. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he had just heard. Then, from deep within the room, so quiet he almost missed it. Another whisper. 2. A countdown. Daniel turned and ran. Daniel sprinted down the hallway, his bare feet slamming against the hardwood floor. He didn't stop until he reached the kitchen, fumbling for the light switch with shaking hands. The brightness flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. Silence. His heart pounded in his ears. He forced himself to take a deep breath. It wasn't real. Couldn't be. Sleep deprivation did strange things to the mind. That was all. But as he turned back toward the dark hallway, his stomach twisted. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had been ajar just moments ago, was now wide open. Daniel stared, willing himself to move. Go back upstairs. Close the door. Lock it. But his feet wouldn't budge. A heavy stillness filled the air, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. It felt like someone or something was standing just beyond the doorway, watching. Then came the whisper, so quiet it barely reached his ears. 1. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The countdown was over. The house seemed to exhale around him, the old wood settling with a groan. And then, a sudden, sharp knock from inside the hidden room. Not on the walls, on the mirror. Daniel turned and bolted. By morning, Daniel had convinced himself it was all in his head. The stress of work, the exhaustion, the unfamiliarity of a new home. He needed a distraction, something real. He decided to dig into the house's history. A few quick searches online brought up the usual, a list of previous owners, old photos of the townhouse from decades past. Nothing unusual. But then, in an archived news article from the 1920s, something caught his eye. A black and white photograph of a man standing in what looked like his very own living room. The caption read, "Prominent socialite Henry Calloway, last seen in his New York residence before his mysterious disappearance in 1923. Daniel frowned. There was something unsettling about the image. The man's face was turned slightly, as if he had been distracted. But it wasn't just that. It was the mirror behind him. Something was there. A blur. A shadow. Daniel squinted at the grainy photograph, his skin prickling. The shape in the mirror, it was in the exact same place where he had seen the figure in his own reflection. He zoomed in, heart hammering. That was when he noticed it. A single, faint word scratched into the glass of the mirror in the photograph. Almost too faded to read. But he could make it out. Help! Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the old photograph. The word, help, was barely visible. But now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. His logical mind tried to dismiss it. Coincidence. A scratch on an old photo. Not a message. Not a warning. But deep down, something in him knew this wasn't over. That night, despite every instinct screaming at him to leave the house, Daniel stayed. He wasn't the kind of man to run from shadows. But he made a decision: he would not, under any circumstances, go near the hidden room. At least that was the plan. Around 2:47 a.m., his laptop screen flickered. Then, the lights in the room dimmed, not all at once, but in a slow, unnatural fade, like a candle being snuffed out. Then his phone vibrated. A message, but it wasn't from a number he recognized. There was no name, no contact, just a single word. Look. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Look where? Then he noticed something. His laptop screen had stopped flickering. And in the reflection of the darkened screen, just over his shoulder, something moved. Daniel spun around, heart hammering. The hallway was empty. But now the hidden room's door, which he had avoided, which he had sworn not to touch, it was open, wide open. A sliver of darkness stretched out from inside. The air was colder than before. But the worst part? The chair. It wasn't empty anymore. Something sat there. Not fully visible, just a shape. A distortion of the air. Like heat rising from pavement. And then, in the heavy silence, came the faintest sound. The slow, deliberate creak of a rocking chair. Daniel took a step back. He was done. He was leaving. But before he could turn, a whisper drifted from inside the room. Not just a whisper. A name. Henry. The same name from the old photograph. The same man who had disappeared in this house a century ago. And as Daniel stood frozen, the rocking chair stopped. The figure in the chair didn't move. But the reflection in the mirror did. Daniel's body locked in place. The breath in his chest felt frozen. Like he had stepped into a space that didn't belong to the living. The reflection in the mirror, the one that should have matched the shape in the chair, was moving. Slowly, unnaturally, it rose from its seated position. But the chair in front of the mirror remained perfectly still. Daniel's mind screamed at him to run, but his body disobeyed. He could only watch as the shape in the mirror straightened, its head tilting slightly, as if studying him. Then the reflection took a step forward, toward him, but the room itself? Empty. A sharp knock jolted Daniel out of his paralysis. Not from the front door, not from the walls, from the mirror. The shape in the reflection had stopped walking. Its face, if it even had one, was close now, just behind where Daniel stood. Close enough that if it were real, he would have felt breath against his neck. Then, right in front of his eyes, something pressed against the inside of the glass. A handprint. Not his. Not human. The fingers were too long, the shape too blurred, as if it belonged to something that didn't fully exist in this world. Daniel stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the rug. He hit the floor hard, his head snapping back against the wooden boards. For a moment his vision swam, and in that moment the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The only light came from the hallway, casting a faint glow across the open doorway. Somewhere too close, a floorboard creaked. Daniel held his breath. His pulse roared in his ears. The air felt different now. Heavy. Wrong. Then came the whisper. Right beside him. Let me out. Something brushed his arm. Daniel lunged for the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because in the mirror he could still see the reflection. And it was still watching him. Daniel didn't stop running until he reached the front door. His shaking hands fumbled with the lock, his breath ragged. Behind him, the air in the house shifted. He could feel it, a presence standing just beyond the threshold of the hallway. Watching, waiting, the mirror, the reflection, the thing that wasn't supposed to be there. Somewhere upstairs, the music started again. That old, scratchy jazz tune, playing from nowhere. But beneath the music, there was something else. A whisper. Let me out. Daniel yanked the door open and stumbled outside. The night air hit him like a shock, and he gulped it down as if he had been drowning. He didn't stop moving until he reached the sidewalk, his heart hammering. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the townhouse. The windows were dark, the place silent, as if nothing had happened. Maybe he could leave. Maybe he should. But then he thought of the photograph. Henry Calloway, the man who disappeared. The man whose reflection had moved when he hadn't. What if Henry had never left the house? What if he was still inside, trapped in the mirror? Daniel clenched his fists. He was not a man who believed in ghosts, but he had seen something. And for the first time since he moved in, he realized the house didn't want him here. It wanted something else. It wanted out. A cold certainty settled over him. The mirror was the key. It had to be. Daniel's feet moved before his brain could stop them. He turned back, stepping toward the townhouse, crossing the threshold once more. The moment he did, the door slammed shut behind him. The air inside was thick, too thick. The house felt alive, like it had been waiting for him to return. The music grew louder, the warped melody swirling through the air. He ignored it. Daniel stormed down the hallway, back toward the hidden room, back to the mirror. The reflection was still there, waiting. It looked more solid now, more real. Daniel grabbed the first thing he could find, a heavy brass lamp from a nearby table. His hands were steady now. No fear, just purpose. And then he swung. The mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crack, shards exploding across the room. For a split second, everything was silent. Then a breath, a real human gasp, sucked in like someone breaking the surface of water after drowning. And then footsteps, soft, slow, coming from behind him. Daniel turned. The chair was empty. The room was empty. And yet he wasn't alone. A shadow stretched across the floor. Long, human. But when Daniel looked up, no one was there. Just the broken mirror. And in one of the remaining shards, he saw it. A man's reflection, not his own. Henry Calloway, smiling. And then the lights went out. By morning, the townhouse was silent. No music. No whispers. Just Daniel, alone, staring at the place where the mirror had been. He left that same day. Never packed. Never looked back. The house was sold again a few months later. The new owners never heard music playing at night. Never saw strange reflections in the mirrors. To them, it was just a house. But sometimes, when the night is just quiet enough, when the air is just a little too still, a soft voice whispers from the shadows, waiting, watching, for the next person who dares to look into the mirror. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.